Canada cannot lose another decade or more to delay and inaction. The world is asking Canada to step up and provide a more stable, democratic, and reliable energy supply that countries around the globe are looking for.
The Alberta and federal government's plans to build a pipeline to the west coast from the oil sands.
So, Danielle Smith shows up with a real pipeline plan, names Trans Mountain and Pembina, lays out the route, and suddenly Mark Carney looks like nobody warned him there would be actual details. Ottawa spent years asking Alberta for a serious proposal. Alberta finally delivered one, and Carney looked ready to ask whether the meeting could go back to speeches.
A long-discussed idea of a new oil pipeline to Canada's west coast appears to be gaining momentum. Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith have unveiled plans for a proposed pipeline that would carry more than 1 million barrels of oil a day from Alberta to the BC coast.
The timing could hardly have been more revealing. Mark Carney spent months talking about nation-building projects, private investment, energy security, and Canada becoming an energy superpower. Then Danielle Smith brought him a project capable of moving more than 1 million barrels of oil per day to the Pacific coast. Suddenly, the man who loves giant economic speeches had to deal with giant economic details. Smith had a route, a construction partner, an industry partner, and a submission date. Carney had facial expressions and a microphone he kept trying to borrow.
The profits from this pipeline will generate billions in revenues over the coming decades for the provincial and federal governments and will enrich Indigenous communities that choose to partner with us. And speaking of oil royalties, Alberta's government is also finalizing another agreement with the federal government and the Oil Sands Alliance to significantly expand oil sands production and advance pathways.
Pembina's involvement matters because Carney had already made private participation one of his conditions. He wanted a serious company willing to attach expertise and capital to the proposal. Smith delivered Pembina Pipeline Corporation, a Calgary-based company with major pipeline experience. Pembina could initially hold a 10% stake, with the possibility of reaching 20%. Carney should have welcomed the development immediately. Instead, the announcement exposed how Ottawa keeps inventing tests for Alberta and then acts strangely uncomfortable when Alberta passes them.
Well, the same organization that built TMX is going to build this. There is a private company that is involved, Pembina. They are going to have a minimum 10% ownership stake. It could move up to 20% according to a press release that the company put out.
The project was submitted for consideration as a project of national interest under the Building Canada Act, with October 1st, 2026 set as the target for a decision. That date now belongs to Mark Carney. He cannot float above the process and blame some nameless department later. The submission is sitting inside his federal machinery. Alberta has placed the evidence in front of him. If the project gets delayed, buried, weakened, or trapped in endless consultation loops, Canadians will know exactly whose government controlled the clock.
If we want Canada to compete and win in a time-bound global race for capital, we need to act differently starting now.
Carney also deserves scrutiny for the investment climate that made this public partnership necessary. Pipeline companies have spent years watching governments approve projects, encourage spending, and then reverse direction when politics changes. Northern Gateway received approvals before Ottawa cancelled it. Keystone XL had approvals and construction activity before its presidential permit disappeared. Energy East reportedly spent around $1 billion moving through the regulatory process before the project collapsed. Investors remember these disasters. Apparently, Ottawa expects them to forget everything after hearing one enthusiastic Carney speech. Carney keeps talking about reducing risk for private capital as though he arrived from another planet and discovered Canadian regulation yesterday. Ottawa helped create the risk. Federal policy taught companies that approvals can expire politically, sunk costs can become worthless, and elected governments can abandon infrastructure after years of work. Now Carney presents taxpayer participation as a brilliant cure. His government is offering public money to solve a trust problem built by government. That is the kind of efficiency only Ottawa could advertise with a straight face.
Say that Alberta's government has formally filed our West Coast oil pipeline submission to the Federal Major Projects Office for Project of National Interest listing under the Building Canada Act. I'm also pleased to announce Alberta's government is entering into a partnership with Trans Mountain Corporation.
Danielle Smith's decision to choose the southern route also exposes years of wasted time. The proposed pipeline would begin near Bruderheim, Alberta, follow much of the existing Trans Mountain corridor, and reach a deep water terminal on British Columbia's southwest coast. Alberta examined northern and southern options before selecting the southern path. The reasons were practical. Existing infrastructure already runs through the area. Indigenous relationships already exist along much of the corridor. The route can reach the market faster. Private companies tend to appreciate those details because they eventually need revenue.
Alberta selected a southern route from Bruderheim, Alberta, to a deep-water VLCC-capable port terminal.
The northern route carried heavier political and regulatory problems, including the federal oil tanker moratorium along British Columbia's north coast. Smith avoided that trap by selecting a southern destination outside the moratorium area. That decision left Ottawa with one fewer obstacle to put in Alberta's way. The southern proposal could reportedly be completed 2 or more years faster than the northern option. In the energy business, 2 years can mean billions in revenue, thousands of jobs, and years of royalties. In Ottawa, 2 years apparently means another committee.
Following the existing Trans Mountain pipeline corridor, this project builds on existing infrastructure. It reflects feedback from Indigenous groups and the government of British Columbia, reduces regulatory barriers, given it would not be subject to the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, and gets Canada's most valuable natural resource to global markets faster.
The federal government also announced around $10 billion for major improvements connected to port infrastructure in the Delta and Salwasan area. So Carney's government is willing to spend billions improving the region's trade capacity while still treating the pipeline feeding that trade corridor like a philosophical puzzle. How does that make sense? Ottawa wants export infrastructure, Asian customers, economic diversification, and stronger Canadian sovereignty. Alberta offers the oil and the route. Carney still behaves like approval requires solving an ancient riddle carved into the walls of Parliament.
Beneath our feet here in Alberta, we stand on oil reserves valued at more than $9 trillion. This resource wealth presents our nation with boundless opportunities. Developing these resources would equate to hundreds of billions of dollars in government revenue that could be used to support core social programs like healthcare and education.
The scale of Alberta's resource base makes every federal delay look even more reckless. Danielle Smith valued Alberta's oil reserves at more than $9 trillion. That wealth could produce hundreds of billions in government revenue over time. Healthcare, education, Indigenous partnerships, defense commitments, public infrastructure, and debt reduction all depend on governments having serious revenue. Carney speaks constantly about protecting Canadian institutions. Alberta is showing him where the money can come from. His political instincts still seem more comfortable regulating prosperity than allowing it to happen. The proposed pipeline would move more than 1 million barrels per day toward global markets, particularly Asia. Smith also cited ATB estimates suggesting that 1.5 million barrels of additional production could generate roughly $30 billion every year. Using a 1 million barrel comparison, she placed the potential annual economic impact near $20 billion. That figure would repeat for as long as the pipeline operates. Every year of delay, therefore, has a measurable cost. Carney cannot describe delay as caution when billions in potential national income remain stranded behind federal hesitation.
Helping to meet Alberta's goal to double oil production to 8 million barrels per day over the next 10 to 15 years. This project will be built safely and efficiently through an unprecedented public-private partnership between both the Alberta and federal governments with Pembina pipelines.
Canada currently depends heavily on the United States as the main buyer of its oil. That dependence weakens Canadian bargaining power and contributes to the price gap between Canadian crude and other international benchmarks. A West Coast route would create access to Asian markets and give producers more options. Carney regularly talks about diversifying trade, especially during periods of uncertainty with Washington. Alberta has now offered him the infrastructure needed to make that policy real. If he blocks it, his diversification strategy becomes another expensive slogan printed on a podium.
But I say to all people across Alberta and across Canada, we will get the job done. The window of opportunity is open now. Recent global events have made it clear that Canada's safe and reliable sources of oil, gas, critical minerals are vital to the world's economy.
What makes Carney's position so pathetic is the amount of evidence he claims to need before making a decision. Alberta has a $9 trillion resource base. The project could move more than 1 million barrels daily. Pembina is involved. Trans Mountain can plan and construct it. The Southern Corridor uses existing infrastructure. The route avoids the northern tanker ban. The project could generate billions annually and strengthen access to Asia. At some point, hesitation stops looking responsible. It starts looking like a prime minister desperately searching for a new excuse. Danielle Smith has forced Carney into a simple political test. He can approve a project that supports jobs, exports, Indigenous ownership, government revenue, and national energy security. He can also drag it through Ottawa's usual maze and prove that his speeches about prosperity were carefully rehearsed theater. Every deadline now deserves close public scrutiny. Carney wants credit for the announcement because the cameras were present. The real judgment begins when permits, money, contracts, and construction schedules replace applause. Alberta has delivered the proposal. Mark Carney now owns every delay.
Canadians' announcements will catalyze well over $200 billion in direct investments in Canada, create over 175,000 new jobs across the country, and we are just getting started. These benefits will be shared widely.
Mark Carney stood beside Danielle Smith and proudly announced that these projects could unlock more than $200 billion in direct investment and create over 175,000 jobs across Canada. He even called that estimate a lowball figure. That level of confidence is almost impressive. Ottawa spends years making energy investment harder, then Carney steps onto a stage and introduces the jobs as though he personally discovered oil beneath Alberta. Albertans have been asking for market access for years. Carney finally repeats their argument and somehow expects a national round of applause. Danielle Smith connected the pipeline to Alberta's plan to double oil production to roughly 8 million barrels per day over the next 10 to 15 years. That scale would create work across construction, engineering, transportation, maintenance, refining, Indigenous businesses, and oil sands. Operations. These jobs come from actual production and infrastructure. They do not come from another federal strategy document filled with phrases about unlocking potential. Alberta already possesses the potential. Carney's government controls several of the locks, then acts surprised when everyone asks him for the keys.
Our oil sands partners will have the incentives they need to launch a super cycle of production growth in Canada's most valuable deposit of natural resources.
Alberta is also planning natural gas power generation connected to data centers and artificial intelligence development. One proposed power and AI project alone could involve at least 1,000 jobs. That gives Alberta a chance to connect its existing energy strength with industries that require huge amounts of reliable electricity. Carney loves talking about the future economy, but computers cannot run on political slogans. Data centers need power every second of the day. Alberta can provide it. Ottawa's contribution usually arrives in the form of another condition, explaining why dependable energy must apologize for existing.
Canada cannot lose another decade or more to delay and inaction. We've heard this very clearly from our international partners from Japan, South Korea, India, Malaysia, and Indonesia.
The employment numbers also expose how long federal hesitation has held Alberta back. Carney wants Canadians to celebrate 175,000 potential jobs today, without asking how many opportunities disappeared during the previous decade of cancelled projects, regulatory uncertainty, and restricted export capacity. Young workers cannot pay rent with a future consultation. Skilled tradespeople cannot build a career around federal announcements that never reach construction. Carney should explain why these jobs suddenly became valuable after Ottawa spent years treating Alberta's main industry like an embarrassing relative at a family dinner. Ottawa enjoys making enormous promises when cameras are rolling. The interesting part begins when somebody asks them to build something. Danielle Smith has placed a real project on Carney's desk, and Canadians deserve to know whether he signs the papers or hides behind another department.
Looking at where the world is right now, with Europe talking about suspending their industrial pricing, the Americans not having it at all, industry telling us that There are more attractive environments to invest in because they don't have carbon taxes. I mean, I think all of that has to be brought into context.
The largest threat hanging over this proposal comes from the Pathways carbon capture project and Carney's obsession with attaching climate conditions to every barrel Alberta produces. Pathways is described as the world's largest carbon capture and storage project. The broader agreement aims to reduce emissions by 16 million tons every year, which Carney compared to removing about 90% of Alberta's cars from the road. That sounds impressive at a press conference. The harder question concerns the bill. Nobody has clearly explained who will pay for the enormous infrastructure required to reach that target. 5 major oil sands producers still need to commit enough volume to fill the pipeline. Those companies would likely sign long-term transportation agreements covering 20 to 30 years. They will also need to invest billions in additional production. Carney expects them to make those commitments while future carbon costs remain uncertain. The possibility of carbon pricing reaching around $130 per ton by 2040 changes every investment calculation. Why would a company promise decades of pipeline payments when Ottawa can keep increasing the cost of producing the oil that must travel through it?
The cost, a minimum of $35 billion. It could go up into the mid-40s. We should point out that it was around $8 billion. That was the guesstimate when the Trans Mountain pipeline was bought by Justin Trudeau.
Former TransCanada executive Dennis McConaughey placed the likelihood of securing convincing producer commitments at roughly 50-50. That assessment came after Carney and Smith delivered their celebratory announcement. Half a chance is hardly the certainty Carney's performance suggested. McConaughey identified producer commitments, pathways financing, and carbon policy as major unresolved issues. Carney knows these obstacles exist because many of them come directly from federal policy. He is presenting himself as the man advancing the project while keeping his foot close enough to the brake to stop it whenever his political base complains.
The West Coast Pipeline, doubling oil sands production growth, and the Pathways project together will define Alberta's and Canada's economic future.
The ownership structure creates another uncomfortable question for Carney. Pembina's initial share would be around 10% and could later rise to 20%. That leaves federal and provincial governments carrying most of the early ownership and construction exposure. Trans Mountain Corporation, which is federally owned, would plan and construct the pipeline. Pembina would contribute industry knowledge, operating experience, and capital discipline. Carney previously emphasized the need for private participation. Alberta produced a private partner, and Ottawa quietly accepted a structure where taxpayers remained responsible for most of the risk. The estimated construction cost could begin near $35 billion and rise into the mid-$40 billion range. Canadians have already seen how pipeline estimates behave once Ottawa becomes involved. The Trans Mountain expansion was estimated at roughly $8 billion when the federal government purchased it. Its final cost climbed beyond $30 billion. Carney should explain how he plans to prevent another explosion in costs before asking taxpayers to admire his nation-building ambitions. Calling a project profitable does not erase construction risk. It simply makes careful management more important, which is rarely Ottawa's favorite part.